And welcome everybody. My name is Mimi Enright and I'm the program coordinator for the UC Master Gardener program of Sonoma County. Tonight's webinar is being offered in both English and Spanish. You have an option at the bottom of your screen, which will enable in just a minute to choose which language room you'd like to choose to be in for this webinar. And I will turn it over to our interpreters to interpret that for us.
Muy buenas tardes. El seminario del día de hoy se está presentando en inglés y en español. Si desean escuchar la interpretación a español, por favor utilicen el botón del globo terráqueo que se encuentra en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Elijan el idioma de su preferencia y a continuación, si escuchan los dos idiomas, pueden seleccionar silenciar el audio original para escuchar únicamente la interpretación. Gracias. Over to you, Mimi.
Great. Thanks. So Jen, do you want to start up the interpretation channel?
Lost my menu.
Is it up at the top? If you need to stop screen sharing.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, starting. Back to screen share. Oh no.
So everyone, please go ahead and you can click that interpretation globe that now shows up on the bottom of your Zoom screen and choose whether you want to hear today's webinar in English or in Spanish. That will be particularly important when we do the Q&A session. And no poor Jen has to do. There you go.
There we go.
So again, welcome to our webinar presentation tonight by the Resilient Landscapes Coalition on summer landscape maintenance in the Defensible Space Zone. And Jen, do you want to go to the next slide, please? So this is a webinar. Your video and your microphone are inactive. We are recording tonight's webinar, so we will be sharing the link to the recording to everyone who registered after the event. Please place any questions you have in the Q&A box, not the chat section, and we'll be have a Q&A session at the end of Jennifer's presentation where we can take you through and answer any questions that may have surfaced or that you may have brought to the webinar tonight. Next slide, please. So the Resilient Landscapes Coalition is a coalition of 4 different organizations, including Fire Safe Sonoma, Habitat Corridor Project, Sonoma Ecology Center, and the UC Master Gardener program of Sonoma County. We've got Rachel Bean on tonight from Sonoma Ecology Center, and we'll be joined by another colleague, April Owens from Habitat Corridor Project, who will be participating in the Q&A session with us at the end of the presentation. And it is, we're very grateful to the County of Sonoma for funding our coalition work on defensible space educational outreach in our community here in Sonoma County. So would like to introduce Jennifer Roberts, our presenter tonight. Jennifer is has worn many hats, is a master composter, a master gardener. She works as a landscape designer at Habitat Corridor Project. And we're very grateful to have her as a member of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition presenting to you tonight on maintenance in the Defensible Space Zone, summer maintenance for your Defensible Space Zone. So I'll turn it over to Jen.
Thank you so much, Mimi. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. So let's take a look at our agenda for the evening. First, we're going to start with what is defensible space? Why is this important? And what does it mean? And then we're going to talk about the maintenance practices that we can do in the defensible space for overall plant health. So I'll talk about pruning, mowing, mulching, irrigation, and composting. And then I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the maintenance practices within the zones, but it's all going to kind of blend and flow as we go through it. So I think you'll have a great understanding of what steps to take in each defensible space zone as we go through it. And then at the end, I'll share a few resources and then take any questions in the Q&A box. Okay, so I like to start this talk with this graphic because it shows the fire behavior triangle. So how fire behaves. It's good for us to understand this when we're thinking about how to protect ourselves from a wildfire event. So the first leg of this is the weather. This is how much wind, what the temperature is, how much humidity there is, and precipitation. The next leg is topography. So that's the slope or aspect of the land. And then the last leg is fuel. Then the amount of fuel, the arrangement of the fuel, and the moisture content. So when thinking about these three things that you need or that help determine how fire behaves in our landscape, looking at weather, we can't really control the weather. Topography, can't really control that, or at least it's very hard to. But fuel is the thing that we can control. So how much fuel is present, how it's arranged, and what kind of moisture content it has. So keep that in mind as we move through the presentation. So there's three main ways that fire moves through a landscape. And the first one is embers. The second one is radiant heat. And the third one is direct flame. So embers are blowing around during a fire, as you can see here, and they're blowing in the wind, whether that's wind that already exists because it's a windy day, or often fires can create their own weather and their own wind. So this is a huge factor in determining how a fire behaves. So embers blowing around will land on any material in the vicinity. And if it's a combustible type of material, then we can have a fire or many small fires starting. Radiant heat works if one type of structure is on fire and that heat gets so hot, it can actually light things on fire that are near it or next to it. So as demonstrated here with fire in an outbuilding, it could affect a home. And then the last way is with direct flame. And I think this is the way that we most often think about fires, that there's a wall towards our home. And this does happen, of course, and we have to protect ourselves from all three kinds of the way fire behaves. But the most important one is embers. Embers actually cause the majority of structure fires during a wildfire event. And that's because they're blowing all around and potentially landing on things that could combust. So the greater way to approach fire safety in our landscape and in our home is to first start with the home. And we say that you harden your home and then work outward into the landscape. And in fact, when you guys registered for this workshop, we asked how many of you had hardened your home or taken steps towards that. And 77% of you actually have already done some work hardening your home. So that's fantastic. And if those of you who haven't, it's a great place to start. But I'm not going to focus on that part tonight. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about the landscape, the area around the home. And 72% of you actually said that you'd already taken some steps doing landscape work. So great job. Thanks for joining us tonight to learn even more. So what is defensible space? It's the area around your home from 0 feet to 100 feet. And there's 3 zones typically when we talk about defensible space. The first zone we call zone 0. I know it's a little tricky. The second zone is called zone 1, and the third zone is called zone 2. The first zone, zone 0, is 0 feet to 5 feet out from your home. So 5 feet away from your front door and all around the home, and 5 feet away from any outbuildings or even fences. We call this the ember defense zone. The next zone, zone 1, is 5 feet out from the home to 30 feet out from the home. So moving outwards. And we call that the lean, clean, green zone. And the last zone is 30 feet to 100 feet out, and that's the reduced fuel zone. So a little bit more about each zone. So Ember Defense is the areas closest to the home, including fences, decks, outbuildings. So as you can see here. And what the biggest thing or the biggest tip for tonight is to try and put non-organic mulch in this area or nothing flammable. Now, we understand this is not always feasible, not always the case, but doing your best to have non-ignitable material closest to your home is the way to go. The next zone, 5 to 30 feet out, you can start to have groupings of plantings, like here, and they can be separated by a non-combustible pathway. So we call these groupings islands. So if you hear me refer interchangeably to islands or groups of plantings, that's what I mean. And the best way to set them up is to have some kind of non-combustible material surrounding them. And this area can include irrigated native grasses. And the last zone, the reduced fuel zone, you can start to have larger groupings of plantings, as you can see here, and more trees. And these zones can also have fire breaks with non-combustible materials in between. And don't worry, we'll talk more about that, and we're definitely going to talk about trees. So the first step when approaching any kind of work like this is you want to be thinking about your personal risk assessment. So every home, every landscape is unique, and they all need to be considered individually. Of course, be thinking about neighboring properties and the area that you live in. Sonoma County has 35 different microclimates, so it's hard to give one presentation that will cover every kind of risk assessment. But things for you to know are, do you live in for example, a high fire severity zone? So those are actual zones that have been designated, they're called that, and they have the highest fire risk. So you might be making certain choices for your landscape that someone who lives in a different risk zone, say closer to the coast, they would be making different choices. So always consider your individuality. And the best way to do that is to walk your property, sit out on your front porch, observe your garden, and do it seasonally. At least 4 times a year, taking stock, spending time out there, and thinking about what kinds of things you have to your advantage or disadvantage. So asking questions like, what kind of soil do I have? How much water fell this year? Did I have puddling or pooling of water? Do I have slope and runoff issues? Did I see pollinators in my garden this summer or spring? Do I get wildflowers? Do I have a lot of weeds that are invasive? So asking yourself all these questions will help inform the kind of maintenance work you need to do that affects your personal risk. And that determines your maintenance needs. So one thing we always talk about, especially the master gardeners, are always saying, right plant, right place. So this goes for any type of plant. The picture on the left, you can see a tree has been planted too close to this home. As a result, the tree is leaning. It's grown in a leaning growth pattern. So therefore, the trunk is not as strong. The roots are compromised because half of the roots would be growing into the home or foundation. So both of these things are a potential hazard to the home and people around the landscape. So always being mindful of how we're planting our plants. The garden on the right, each plant was given a lot of space for the plant to grow to its natural, it could grow as much as it wanted in that space. And this is something to think about when we're planting, whether we're doing trees, small shrubs, perennials, annuals, whatever it is, just thinking about their full growth potential. And if we do good design when we're planting, that allows for easy maintenance. So we are in late summer in Sonoma County, and the weather is providing some of its hottest temperatures in, July, August, and into September, even October in some years. And we might have more winds, more sustained winds. Again, it depends where in the county you are. And this time of year is our greatest fire danger. So we want to be vigilant. Numerous small fires have popped up around the county already this year. And so we always want to be thinking about that and all things that go into it in terms of preparing yourself if you have to evacuate. But before we get anywhere near that point, preparing yourself on your landscape and at your own home. And then the nights are starting to cool off at this time of year. We're getting shorter days slightly, and we are getting more of that nighttime chill. The plants are doing little to no growth at this time of year. It's often too hot, and a lot of our natives are actually not growing. They're just sustaining. They might be blooming or going into seed production. And in fact, our native oak trees are dormant at this time of year. So do not water your oak trees right now because they're not ready to drink. They are actually dormant. This time in California, because we have a summer dry climate, is kind of like our winter, meaning like our dormant winter. Whereas on the East Coast, in winter, everything's dormant. That's happening here now. But not everything. Some things are blooming. Buckwheats are really having their moment right now. Here's a buckwheat. And monkey flowers, sages, goldenrod, poppies. You might be seeing blooms still. You might be seeing them put up their vegetative growth in preparation for fall. California fuchsias, yarrow, coyote mint, and California honeysuckle are all blooming right now. Buckwheats and sages have so many varieties. So some people in the questions that when they took their little survey, when you signed up for this workshop, were asking about which kinds of plants to plant in specific areas of our county. We don't have time to go into all the detail of that tonight, but look into buckwheats and sages because there's absolutely a type for your area. So if you have a lot of sun, hot afternoon sun, wind, there is a sage and a buckwheat for you. And the same goes for if you're living in a more coastal area. Late summer is for reaping the harvest, keeping plants properly hydrated, pruning, preparing for planting, and collecting seed. Preparing for planting might look like anything from making a list of native plants that you might be excited to purchase for fall, to deciding where they're going to go in your garden. Or if you have an established garden, you could be preparing your soil, adding more mulch, adding compost, or even making your own compost at home to get ready to spread in the fall. So let's talk about maintenance practices in a little more detail. We're going to talk about pruning, mowing, irrigation, mulching, and composting and mulching. And all of these things can be done regularly, annually, and long-term. So trying to think of your landscape as an ongoing project, but in a good way, not like but in that you're always planning for the next season and for the year as a whole. So pruning, the basics. So pruning is an art and a science. And when we prune plants, we prune for vigor, health, and safety. Our goal is to maintain the integrity and balance of a plant. So thinking about that tree that was planted too close to the home, that tree did not have good integrity, and it's likely not balanced. We can't see the top of the plant, but we assume that it's leaning. So we want full growth plants that can grow to their full capacity. We also want to prune for anything that's dead, dying, diseased, or crossing. So that's when you're looking at a plant, if you're seeing dead material, anything that's dying back, has disease, or if branches are crossing and moving inward towards the plant, pruning some of those out is helpful. And we always want to work with clean and sharp cutting tools to help prevent the spread of disease. And we want to go slow, step back, and always be asking, why am I making this cut? So now thinking about pruning specifically for fire safety. So our goals are to have what's called horizontal and vertical spacing. So we want to be thinking about spacing between plants, between structures. We want to be thinking about the space going up and down and side to side. We always want to be removing any dead material. And we want to use a technique called thinning, which I'll talk about on the next slide, versus hedging. So hedging is what you can see here. And this is a hedging tool. That's just coming in and making indiscriminate cuts down the side of a plant. It's what's used in topiary or rounding of bushes often, or making a wall of a bush. But what you can see is that in reality, only the very tips of these plants are alive. And inside, it's a lot of dead and woody material. Now, if you go think back to that ember situation where you have a firestorm of embers blowing around, embers getting stuck here could be a big problem. So this is just one example of how we want to be shifting our mindset to how we prune and maintain our landscape for fire safety. And also we want to be pruning to rejuvenate plants. This is a Western redbud, and at the end of the flowering season, it's a good idea to come in and take off any spent seed pods. And this goes for any type of plant. You can be deadheading and removing dead material. Another big concept of thinking about our landscape with pruning for fire safety is eliminating fuel laddering. So this concept is that if fire is coming through and spreading along the ground, if we have material that's quite tall and almost to the tree canopy, this low fire can then ignite the tree canopy and now become a bigger fire and a bigger problem. So when we're thinking about that vertical and horizontal spacing, we want to be thinking about shrubs or grasses on the ground and how much space they have between trees and neighboring plants. So from the ground, with grasses or like ground covers, 6 feet is an ideal spacing. And if we have shrubs of a certain height, then 3 times that shrub's height to the tree canopy is how much space we should have. So these are the recommendations to prevent fire fuel laddering. Here's an example of that in the real world. So here we have this juniper bush that's grown around this tree and is starting to get up and closer to the tree canopy. So easy work, well, easy depending, but the simple solution is to create space between the tree trunk and the plant, and then also cut it down at the top so there's more space between the shrub and the tree canopy. And the other thing that happens with juniper specifically, but lots of woody shrubs, is they get very dense on the inside. And so that growth, again, is just towards the ends. So we want to clean out any of that dead material from inside the shrub. Another method of fuel laddering is through vines. So we want to eliminate vines that are growing up into trees and into the canopy. And also we want to cut back those vines that are covering a home. Now, wisteria is very popular. It's very beautiful. And we understand, especially if it's a very old established wisteria or another type of vine, we're not saying come in and cut everything out. Again, this is depending on your risk factor where you live, but there are ways to maintain and cut out dead, dying material or cut back on vegetative material. So it's a very sparse but still beautiful specimen of a vine. So there are ways to work with it, but something like this definitely needs work. So a little bit more about spacing with pruning. Something to know is that fire travels faster uphill. So we want to maintain spacing between groups of plants. And that spacing gets bigger if they're on some kind of slope. So if you have less than a 20% slope, trees can be 10 feet apart. And that 3 times spacing of the shrub on the ground. So you could have 3, you want to have spacing of 3 shrubs between the tree canopy and the shrub. But those spacings need to get bigger as the slope increases. So less than 20%, the one way is okay. But if it's more than 20%, so 21 to 40% slope, it's ideal to have more spacing between trees. And you can still have the 3 times the height shrub spacing, but you can do more. You can always do more. So when I keep talking about shrubs, there's 2 main types of shrubs. There's herbaceous perennials that are non-woody, and then there's woody shrubs. So both of them can have diseased or dead plant parts removed at any time of year. And in fact, that's what you should be doing. So see here, there's all this dieback that should be removed. And this we've seen before. And this is so beautiful while it's in full bloom. Then once it's done, pruning out what's dead and consider deadheading, maybe not all of it. And when I say deadheading, I mean removing the spent flower heads. But you can leave some for pollinators, and we do recommend that as well. But woody shrubs should be cut back every 2 to 3 years to reduce that old woody growth. And then here's a note about shearing again. Summer pruning is specific. So some of our natives, including manzanitas, toyon, and ceanothus, are actually best pruned or thinned for shape during the summer months. So right now. So they're done flowering, they're spring flowers. And so now is the time to come in, deadhead, spent flower heads, and prune for shape. And many perennials and semi-evergreen species, such as sage, should be deadheaded throughout the summer and fall. This not only is good for fire safety, but it increases more blooms to keep coming. Here's a tip, or this is the one when I keep saying pruning or thinning. So this is what I mean by thinning. And this is a very important technique. And it's in fact my favorite way to approach pruning a tree or a shrub. You're just taking out certain parts of the specimen. You're not coming in and shearing or pruning every branch. You're selecting certain ones. And in this case, you can see that the smaller outgrowth from the main branches have been pruned out. So this allows more light to get through. This cuts back on the density and in turn can be a safer choice for fire risk. This is a great way to control the size and the shape of a specimen, and it can help develop the tree's natural beauty. You know what it looks like when you look at a tree that has just beautiful form and it's not, dense in certain parts. And of course, this depends on the tree specimen, but your eye definitely notices it. So think about sculpting and pruning, thinning your at least your specimen plants. So the ones that are the largest in your landscape. And also you can do this with shrubs. So it can be beneficial to thin, or we say limb up a shrub. Limb up means take these bigger or smaller, lower branches. So you can actually make a shrub look more like a tree. So then you're getting more of that vertical spacing for fire safety. So when you are considering pruning trees, do consult a licensed arborist if needed, especially with large trees, especially with heritage trees, that is required. And many of our oaks in Sonoma County are protected. So do make sure that you are doing everything lawfully before getting into any large tree work. And never prune trees that are near electric lines. We recommend removing lower limbs of trees 6 feet from the ground, or 1/3 of the height of the tree if it's over 30 feet tall. Avoid fuel ladders by keeping distance from lower plants, like we talked about, 3 times the understory height. And county code requires 10 feet distance of branches from any chimney or stovepipe. So make sure you have 10 feet away from trees. Timing is important for pruning trees, whether we're doing it for vigor or growth, or we're trying to cut back on some of the growth and shape the tree. And it depends on the type of the tree and your goal. So fruit trees are often pruned in their dormant season, which is winter. Pines are pruned in December and January. Deciduous oaks prune in winter. Evergreens prune in early spring or midsummer. And evergreen oaks, you can prune July through October when they're dormant. So this is the only thing right now as far as trees to be pruning. And trees can overhang the roof, but you want to keep a clearance of those branches at least 6 feet from the roof. So we did have some questions about how can I maintain shade over my home? I want to keep my trees. I love my trees. Like, are you telling me that we have to get rid of them? And the answer is no. Through careful maintenance, 6 feet clearance, you can keep your trees near your home. And the other important bit of that is that you want to maintain leaf litter. So even if you don't have deciduous trees, meaning trees that lose all their leaves, all trees are dropping leaves at some point in their life cycle, and these might be collecting on the roof or in your gutters. So you want to be vigilant about getting rid of leaf litter. And we do not recommend topping your trees. So that means this is a redwood right here. It came in and literally cut the top off. Or here, this is a kind of a different style of topping a tree, but we don't recommend doing this. It's really stressful for the tree. It's not healthy for them. And if it's done too much, it can kill the tree. So we do recommend thinning instead of topping and maintaining that integrity and balance. Here's that deadheading technique that I've mentioned. So this is removing dead blooms. So this bloom's dead. You just come in, snip off down here the dead bloom, leave the live blooms. Or if everything's dead, you can come and cut off most of it and leave some for seed if you want to collect seed, or leave some of them for different birds to come eat the seed, because we don't want to eradicate all of their food, but leave some. So this can encourage a rebloom, leave some for seeding and wildlife. And penstemon and monkeyflower do really well with deadheading. And here's another look at that technique, thinning. So before and after thinning. This specific example reminds me a lot of how we work. I was going to say rose bushes, but we really cut back rose bushes. But this technique, just getting in there and thinning out material. Another thing you can do is cut back hard or coppice plants. So if you have a fully grown plant, you can come in and really cut a lot away. So this would be the rosebush technique. And then the next year, it's going to push growth out, and then you have a new growth pattern, fresh, vegetative growth and new blooms. So it could be a way, if your plant has disease or if the growth pattern is super dense, you can come in and cut pretty drastically. Epilobium can take this, Muhlenbergia, and Baccharis or California fuchsia, deergrass, and coyote brush. And coppicing is another technique, and that's where the plant has one stem or one trunk, and you would cut pretty low, and then it will sprout lower down. So you're, creating new growth from a lower standpoint. And here you can tell this is coyote brush, and that's been cut back. So this was like big woody old growth, cut it back, and then new sprouts start. So it'll have a new growth pattern and be healthier. Just a little on pruning techniques. When you are making the actual physical cut, how that works, you want to cut above a bud. So that's a little bud. You want to cut above it, and you want to do it as a diagonal angle. 45 degrees is recommended for most plants. So you can do it too angular, too low, too high. And this is good for plants that have an opposite growth pattern. So there's two buds on the side. You want to cut to a lateral branch and avoid cutting any branch collar if there is one. So that's important for trees. There's like another little extra growth right where the tree branch touches the trunk. So be mindful of that collar. And you want to avoid leaving stubs because that can create dieback or weak growth. And you don't really need wound dressing. We don't really recommend that anymore. Okay, so now let's talk about mowing. So in terms of fire safety, when we're mowing, we only want to use a mower before 10 a.m. when we have dry weather. So I would say even this time of year, we really shouldn't be mowing too much. Like a lot of things, a lot of those annual grasses have gone through their life cycle. You've hopefully mowed them earlier in the season and they haven't grown back yet. But if there are areas that you just haven't gotten to yet, or now you're attending this webinar and you want to do more work, then make sure you're mowing before 10 a.m. And don't do that work if it's windy or excessively hot. And definitely not on a red flag warning day, which is when it's really hot and windy. And this is because hot engines can ignite dry grass. And when you are doing this kind of work, you should have a water supply and a fire extinguisher near. And also, the flip side of this is don't mow if the ground is saturated, because you don't want to harm the soil. You don't want to create divots in the soil or create compaction. And this is a tip just to remember for the spring. If you're mowing in the spring, which you should be, you want to survey for birds and avoid areas where they're nesting. So always walk your property first, get out there, take a peek, see if there's any birds nesting, because you don't want to meet them with the mower first. Okay, when thinking about mowing, you want to stay ahead of the weeds. This is a big thing to consider. So this is like more for spring and early summer maintenance, but you want to prevent these seed heads from forming. So here's seed heads, here, these guys. So if you think about it, this, one of these little purple white stalks has tons of seeds in it, and every single one of those can become the next plant. So not letting any type of grass get to this seed form is your best bet for dealing with weeds. And if at all possible, remove any invasive or high risk plants. So removing them by the root is your best bet. But if you're mowing or trimming grass and weeds, you want it to be to 4 inches in the spring and summer. So only 4 inches tall, no taller, and 6 inches next to roadways is okay. If you are mowing a typical lawn, you can leave grass clippings on your lawn as a mulch. So you just cut them. You don't have to collect them, bag them. They can just fall on their own back to the lawn, and it acts as a natural nutrient for your soil and for the lawn. And it helps retain the soil's moisture and keeps the green waste out of the landfill. Hopefully we were not putting that in the landfill at all, but it also just creates less work for you. You can just leave it be. And a string trimmer, like a weed whacker or a mower string trimmer, presents less risk than a mower for starting a fire. So if we're not, well, then also consider electric machines, because if we're not using fuel, there's less of a risk as well. Okay, moving on to mulching. So the definition of a mulch is anything that covers the soil. That can be a mulch, and mulch can be organic or inorganic. So some examples are wood chips, which we also refer to as arbor mulch, stones, gravel, straw, coconut fiber, leaf litter, grass trimmings, like we just talked about, and compost. Compost can even be a mulch. And there's many benefits to using a mulch in the landscape. One of the biggest ones I think we hear the most about is water conservation. So we're protecting the soil and keeping water in the soil, keeping it from evaporating. Mulches also prevent soil compaction, so they work as a buffer between people walking or cars driving or any kind of thing like heavy material or heavy use that would compact the soil. Mulch also prevents erosion, same kind of idea, reduces dust, suppresses weeds, can visually enhance the landscape, and can cool the soil. So not all mulches cool the soil, but many of them do. And organic mulches, such as wood chips, straw, or leaf litter, also improve the soil's tilth, or how easy it is to work with the soil, dig into that soil. So organic mulches can feed the soil and the soil life that is alive down there. Arbor mulch, or composted wood chips, is the type of mulch that we recommend using in our landscapes. So there was a mulch study that was done by the University of California and another university that I'm blanking on, but we do have this link. It should be in the chat, so you can look at the details of this exact study. But they studied 8 types of landscape mulch and found that arbor mulch, which looks like this, is the safest type of mulch for fire spread. So it had the slowest rate of fire spread. And this type of mulch has been composted. So composted wood chips. That means it was left out to the elements, turned, probably watered, and over time it's broken down somewhat. So it's not fresh wood chips. It has been composted, and this produced the slowest rate of spread. So we're not saying it's absolute, but if it did ignite, it was a slow spread of fire. And this mulch should be applied 2 to 3 inches deep. It has a low burn rate, but it may smolder, and it's composted, like I talked about. So we recommend in that first 5 feet of your home or any kind of structure using a non-organic mulch. So not the composted wood chips, but something that's not ignitable, like stone, gravel, brick, pavers, or concrete. So you can see here, there are many options for an inorganic mulch. You can get really creative with designs. It's really fun to work with these different materials. I found as a designer, it's exciting. Instead of just like, oh, we put mulch, it's the wood chips. No, like you can create a lot of visual interest with different materials. And this example is there's 2 inches of base rock that's compacted down really well, and then 1 to 2 inches of 3/4 inch pebble on top. And you can get creative with different kinds of pebble. And same idea here, right along the house, using pebble, then larger rock, and then flagstone. The arbor mulch, though, is acceptable 5 feet to 30 feet out from your home. And you can use it up to 3 inches within the plantings. So here's an example of what I mean, so these are those islands of plants. So these are, somewhat dense plantings of plants. This is 30, at least 5 feet to 30 feet out from the home. There is arbor mulch covering the soil here, and there's arbor mulch between this pathway. Same idea here. We have arbor mulch on the left with some plantings, and then we have this non-combustible pathway that's coming through, separating the other side of the plantings. And then again here, we have, a non-combustible wall material with pebble, then arbor mulch covering the soil where we have plantings, then more pebble, likely a path, and then more planting. So just using different mulches in different ways to create combustible areas, non-combustible areas, and islands of plantings. Also, when considering mulch, you want to avoid this fine bark type of mulch. I'm sure you've seen it around. It's often shredded redwood or shredded cedar, and it's also called gorilla hair or sometimes angel hair, but we don't recommend this type of mulch. This has a high ignition capability. So here you can see this mulch is on fire and is as close to the home. So we don't want to see this type of application. Other things that we don't recommend using are shredded rubber, pine needles, and shredded cedar because it has the highest hazardous combustion characteristics. So these things ignite readily, so we don't recommend them. Now a note about leaf litter, because people ask, well, my trees are dropping a lot of leaves. This seems like it's high combustible material. Am I allowed to have this? What's the deal with leaf litter? And our answer is that it is important for nutrients, and it does protect and feed the soil below trees. So it does have an important role in the natural cycle of our trees. And it does break down over the season and feed the tree slowly. But if we are in a really high dry time or high fire time, then it's a good idea to remove excess dead leaves and compost them. But if it's a wet time of year, you can keep more leaf litter. So our answer is it depends, right? So again, considering your personal situation and your fire severity risk. And irrigated native grasses are okay in the 0 to 5 foot zone and the 5 to 30 foot zone. So this is an example of a native bent grass. So it's well irrigated, it's maintained, it's next to a non-combustible material. So there are ways to have well-maintained, like alive things near your structures, but there's certain better recommended ways to do that. Okay, moving on to irrigation. So irrigation is something that's very important to consider, and it's how we can keep our plants hydrated and therefore less flammable. But the flip of that is that we want to avoid excess watering. So of course we want to be conserving water. We do live in a summer dry climate. We in California do have periods of drought. But even if we're not in a designated drought time, we always want to be thinking about conserving water. Also, we don't want to overwater because we don't want to promote excessive growth. Because if we have plants that are growing too fast, their growth isn't healthy. And then if we have a lot of extra growth, it might require thinning or removal. So it's a balance. Excess watering can also kill plants, especially natives. So natives prefer a watering cycle of infrequent watering, but when you water, they want to be watered deeply or for a longer amount of time. Just think about mimicking our natural rain cycles. So in the summer, if you're watering a lot of your natives too often or too much, then they might die because that's not part of their normal life cycle. Spring is a great time to change the settings on your irrigation controllers. And then fall is another time that we would be looking at doing that. You want to make sure that you are not watering too much once the rains do start again. So when thinking about irrigation, you want to get to know your plants and you want to determine their thirstiness. So how much water does each type of plant need? So the way you do that is consider the sun exposure, the slope, the wind, the species of plant you have, the season it is, and how mature the plant is. When you first plant a new plant or put in a new garden, you are going to be watering more often because you are encouraging these plants to grow deep roots, will in turn grow healthy, bigger plant material. So they're going to need more water. But once they get established and their roots go deeper and deeper, they can find water in the soil below and don't need as frequent watering. This term here, WUCLs, stands for Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. So this is a tool that you can use to help determine how much water your plant will need. So all plants in this survey are given a rating of high, moderate or medium, low, and very low. So you can go to this website here and look up specific plants that you may have. Or if you're starting fresh with a new garden and you only want to use very low water plants, then you can set that classification and search accordingly. So this is a really great tool, great place to start. As I said, natives are adapted to our summer dry climate. So, and I said too, newly planted natives need more water in the beginning. So natives take about 1 to 3 years to establish. So in that first year, you want to check on them weekly, and especially in the summertime. Natives enjoy deep, infrequent watering, and many drink in the winter, right? When we get our rains. So if we have a dry winter, this is where irrigation becomes very important. If we haven't been meeting our rain quota, you definitely want to be checking your soil and checking on your natives. And you can use a moisture meter like this to help you out. There's a couple main ways that we put in irrigation, and one of them is drip. You hear a lot about drip irrigation. This is an example of that. So you can lay this in a grid and then plant your plants. This is if you're starting fresh, or if you're just working on a certain area, drip irrigation is excellent. You want to make sure that you're keeping the emitters, we say, or where the exact point where the water drips out of, away from any plant stem, at least 3 to 6 inches, because you don't want to create a super wet pocket right around that stem that can bring in disease, like a fungal growth. So you want to make sure keeping the root zone, or the area where all the roots will spread out into the soil, you want to keep that moist, but not just right where the stem is in the soil. And then as plants grow, that root zone is going to change. It's going to move outward. So you want to be changing your irrigation or moving your emitters to be mindful of that. When thinking about water on your landscape, we slowing it, spreading it, and sinking it. So slow it, spread it, sink it. This is a way of thinking of, if we do get rainwater, how can it sit on my property or move over my property slowly without creating any harm, like any erosion or any pooling next to structures. So rethinking how we think how water moves on the property, we want to allow water to infiltrate, and that takes time. So we want to slow rain during a rain event and let it sink in. So there's a couple different ways to do that. This here is a rain garden. So this is an actual depression in the soil that is like man-made, but we cover it with rocks of different kinds, and then we plant it with water-loving plants. And so in the height of the season, this will fill up. In the dry time now, we might just be seeing the rocks, but these plants, especially a lot of our native grasses, have very deep roots, so they can survive. They can put those roots down and get that water, and they're holding that water in the soil for us. So creating this rain garden is a way to feed the greater landscape. And then also doing something like this, which might be a little flatter, but this is a dry rain bed or a dry creek bed. And so again, having plantings along it and creating places for water to infiltrate into the landscape. This is a permeable surface. So if we do want to have the look and feel and use of a paved surface, instead of coming in with just concrete, we can use permeable pavers or permeable material that will allow the rain to still infiltrate into the ground. And overall, that we need less irrigation within a landscape if we can use these practices. So we can create swales, keep permeable surfaces, use mulch, because mulch protects the soil from evaporating water, and we can add compost. Compost can hold 3 times its weight in water. So there's lots of inexpensive ways to keep water on our property and doing it in a safe way. Moving on to compost, one of our last landscaping practices. So compost is a type of organic matter that we make, that humans make. So if you think about leaf fall, right, those leaves degrade over time, and that's creating organic matter for the soil. It's feeding the soil. But compost is just the word we use when humans do it. And the way we do that is using our food scraps and yard debris. So we can use our curbside green bin to make compost. So we just throw the scraps and the raw material into the green bin, and it goes on to a big facility and somebody else makes that into compost. Or you can start doing this at home. So you can start a backyard pile or a worm bin. That's what this is here. So this is where you actually have composting worms that will eat this material and turn it into rich, beautiful compost. So compost has numerous benefits, but just a few of them is that it provides nutrients to our soil, retains water, and improves the soil's tilth, or how easy it is to work with that soil. And another benefit of that is that it keeps all of this organic matter that you might be producing, keep it on your property. It is a resource. We do say that compost is black gold. So if you can make it at home, that's great. Or utilizing this program and then maybe going somewhere else to purchase compost and bring it back to your property to reap the benefits. And composting actually is the law. Everyone in California is required to compost in some way. So one of these 3 ways is how we do that. If we're making compost at home, piles can be added to or cured year-round. So we can keep adding material or let it sit year-round. It can be, always composting. But we do want to keep any piles that we have or any compost bins away from structures. Additionally, we want to keep these piles properly hydrated and turned. So you do have to use a tool to get in there and turn that material so it gets aeration or it's exposed to the air. And it can be made and spread year-round. But the best time is in the fall before the rain. So if you're not composting now at home, you can start now and try and get some material finished before we head into fall. And then in fall, you can spread that material. And you can spread that directly on top of the soil. But do be careful because some native plants do not like compost. So if you are working with natives, hopefully you are, do be mindful of which ones do not like that extra nutrition. Okay. Special precautions during high risk time, also known as red flag warning days. So if we are issued a red flag warning day, we should be mindful of the weather day to day, and you can take some of these extra precautions when that is issued. So the first thing to think about is moving any movable objects that are within 5 feet of your home or structures to a place outside of that zone. So moving them at least 5 feet away, and more if you can. So those things are like trash cans, deck furniture, potted plants, mats, tools, anything that could ignite, removing it from that first 5 feet. You also want to check your roof and gutters for any kind of debris, especially if you have a tree that is a heavy shedder. Get rid of that extra debris on your roof or gutters. And then review zone 1, which is that 5 foot to 30 foot zone, to be assured there's no accumulated debris like dry or dead plant material. So any branches, dried leaves, weeds, any of those things we talked about before. And you can give plants an extra soak to assure that they're fully hydrated. That'll just act as an extra buffer for their flammability, potentially. And you definitely don't want to be mowing or using any gas-powered tools during that red flag warning time. Okay, a little bit more review about these maintenance techniques by each zone. So that first zone, which is zone 0, 0 to 5 feet, we want minimal plantings and minimal combustible materials. So removing weeds and debris, including, which is often forgotten about, underneath decks or underneath, stairs or any kind of area, thinking about where embers can get into and collect and then ignite that material. So being mindful of underneath as well. Removing clutter, especially firewood. Firewood should not be stored right next to the house, right next to a shed, right? You want to move that out of that 5 foot zone. Trash cans, any flammable materials. Gutters and roofs, we've talked about. And ensuring adequate irrigation. And pruning any plants that are in that zone if they are there and not able to be removed. Now moving outward from the home to that 5 to 30 foot zone, keeping these plants well hydrated and free of accumulated debris. So leaf litter, weeds, anything like that. Pruning plants for horizontal and vertical spacing. Mowing or removing dead grasses and weeds, and maintaining organic mulch to no more than 2 to 3 inches deep. Zone 2, which is 30 feet to 100 feet away from your home or structure. The reduced fuel zone. So plants are maintained just like in zone 1, but larger plants and groupings of plants or islands are increasingly appropriate, as you can see here. You want to collect branches and other debris, and you want to mow and remove dead grasses and weeds. And then there is a zone 3, which I didn't talk about yet, and this is what we call the beyond 100 foot zone. And this is surrounding wildlands. So if you do have outwards of 100 feet away from any home or structures, then this is what we call beyond. And you want to learn to recognize native plants and invasive species that might live in this area. So you want to know who's supposed to be there, right? Or who might be beneficial, depending on your definition. For example, poison oak. But, learning to recognize what is native to California can be especially helpful when starting out. If you're looking at a lot of space and feeling overwhelmed, learning what plants you do have. And it's a good idea to not modify vegetation without expert help. We do have a lot of resources, the Resilient Landscapes Coalition being one, the UC Master Gardeners are another. Of course, there's tons of information online, but seeking help before you start any big projects or make any big moves And then if necessary or applicable, seeking advice from a restoration or forestry professional can be extremely helpful if you do have a lot of land and are worried about how to responsibly and successfully manage that land. And a note about choosing landscape maintenance professionals. So, it's a good idea to ask them about if they have any Firewise training or any knowledge. You can also ask anyone who might be working with your landscape about their familiarity with California native plants. And you could provide written materials or websites to help guide them to learn more. So working together with any landscape professionals to create a landscape that's beautiful but that is also Firewise. And we have a brochure, we being the Resilient Landscapes Coalition, that is available on our website that can be printed and handed out. And we also have a recorded training for landscape professionals on our YouTube channel. So that is also where this video will end up. So if you want to refer back to anything that we talked about tonight, this video will be on the YouTube, but there's also a special one geared for landscape professionals. And one of your biggest resources for more information on any of these topics is our website, the resilientlandscapescoalition.com. This is our homepage. So you can see how it's divided into working with your house, your landscape. There's a whole section on plant selection, and then also about working in the beyond 100 feet and the surrounding wildlands. The Master Gardeners are a great resource. UC A&R has papers on different topics that I've mentioned tonight, so you can go do further research. Here is that WUCL's website again. And the California Native Plant Society is a huge resource. They, in fact, have recently published their own Firewise guide. So if you want to dive deeper into specific plants and their benefits, use that. And also CalScape is another go-to if you're want to look up specific plants and or start with the area of the county that you live and see which plants are recommended to do really well where you are. And it also shows where those plants might be available for sale. So if you're looking to purchase them at a nursery close to you, you can use CalScape as a resource. Here are some of my sources, including the pruning sources. We will also send out this slideshow to you, so you don't feel like you have to, hurriedly write anything down or screenshot. This will come to you as well to the email that you signed up for this workshop with. And thank you so much for your attention tonight. And here are all the websites of the 4 nonprofits that make up the Resilient Landscapes Coalition. So at this point, we will turn it over to our Q&A section. We have a panel of people to help answer your questions.
Great job, Jen. Do you want me to curate the questions for the
No.
Q&A session?
Excellent, yes.
Okay, good. And welcome April Owens, our colleague on the Resilient Landscapes Coalition.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry I was late to the meeting.
No worries. Glad you're here. So we have a number of questions that have come in during your presentation. Great job, Jen.
Thank you.
And the first one is asking about what is recommended to place beneath river rock in the defensible space area near a home. I understand landscape fabric is not recommended. What will prevent weeds from coming through the rock? And I'm wondering, April, I know through your and Jen's experience with doing landscape installations, you've got a lot of experience in this space. Do you want to start it on that one?
I'm happy to answer that question. So it's always tricky because weeds come in from the top, from birds and everybody. But what we usually use is a couple inches of compacted base rock. And there was another question in there about, like, do you have to rent heavy equipment to do that? But there's a tool that I don't know the name, but it's a 12 by 12 compactor. And so you just lay down the base rock and wet it down really good and use this 12 by 12 tool. Mimi, do you know the name of that? Some kind of, it's
Handheld
You can get it
Compactor?
anywhere. And then put the like a 1/2 inch of any of the what we call pretty rock on top. So you're not wasting, that's the inexpensive surface, because if you put landscape fabric down and then put crushed rock or anything on top, it just really funky and it doesn't, can't rock on it.
Great, thank you, April. Next question, Marie has several questions. First is, are succulents the only fire-safe plants to use in the 0 to 5 foot zone? It's a complicated topic. Succulents certainly are less flammable. They hold a lot of moisture content in their leaves. It's really more about, Jen talked about, you really need to assess the risk factor of where you live. Are you in a high fire, a very high fire severity zone? If so, you really might want to consider the full implementation of the 0 to 5 foot zone, which means no organics, no plant materials. If you just can't help it and you have to have some plants in that material in that zone, then succulents or low growing herbaceous perennials, those non-woody type plant materials that Jen talked about would be appropriate, staying less than like maybe 3 feet in height. But then you've got to be really vigilant about maintaining that and making sure you don't get any debris build up in there. The whole objective is to not create a welcome environment for embers to land, which could then ignite during a wildfire event and ignite your home or structure adjacent. It's particularly important to not do any plant materials under higher risk areas of fire coming into your home, like under windows or in corners so it's kind of a balancing act. And if you absolutely have to have some plant materials in that zone, then succulents are something you can consider. But again, you're going to need to be maintaining that very vigilantly. April and Jen, anything you would add on top of that?
Perfect answer. Sometimes we'll use some containers with like what you said, like even like doubling down, like some containers in the 0 to 5, like at the edge of 0 to 5. I feel like I'm getting more and more vigilant about that 0 to 5 foot zone. And we used if you're near the coast or you're in a cooler climate, you can use blue-eye grass or iris or some things, but really for insurance and everything, I think it's best to be super prudent in that zone.
Yeah, and great comment about the containers, April. I think that's a great approach that folks can use to bring plant materials into that zone. But then again, if you're on a red flag warning day, you're going to want to make sure you're pulling those away from the structure.
You can use wheels under them, get them away, use annuals in them. But hyper vigilant. We just have to we can't really recommend plants in the 0 to 5 anymore.
Yeah. And then the next series of questions from Marie are around native plants. So Jen and April, I'm going to turn that to you. Jen, I think you talked a lot of these really well. How can I find out for each species of native plants how much water is best? What size emitter? So, and then the irrigation questions, right? What size emitters? How many? How often of water? How many minutes? Do some plants require no irrigation after 3 years? So can you speak about irrigation specifically around native plant materials?
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard to talk, in a group of, different plants have different needs, and it definitely depends where you live. April has a lot of experience with like what size emitters, and I know you also I didn't talk about changing out the sprinkler heads. If you want to talk a little bit about that too, April.
The irrigation's always really tricky, and it's evolved over the years. You really want to be conscious of, like Jen said in her presentation, like moving the emitters away from the plants, making sure your landscape's getting enough water. So there's no really with climate change and the heats and the different temperatures we're having now, there's no really walk away situation anymore. Even if you have a grid system like Jen talked about, or MP rotators, which are like a low water use irrigation head, you still need to be really in your garden, understanding at least seasonally what's going on with the plants and what your landscape needs. And you know, sometimes in my own landscapes and some of our clients' landscapes, we go out in the summer 3 times a year, like 3 times a summer, and just do a little overhead watering to cleanse the landscape and kind of see what's going on. But really, you need to be in your landscape and you know, and understand what's really happening out there. Drip is great. You know, all the irrigation systems are great. You just cannot just like walk away from them.
Great. So there's a couple of questions. The wrap-up question from Marie, which I think you touched on a bit in your presentation. Jen, which plant species are best pruned down low to reduce woodiness in the next growing season? And then also a question from Jennifer on when should I prune my coffee berry shrubs and how much should I prune off of them?
I mean, that coffee berry one jumped out at me because I was shocked and surprised and excited to see that I've been able to prune coffee berries even like in the defensible space zone, or when they're getting too big, like really hard, and they come back well with irrigation. But it still depends, like Jennifer was saying, on how hot it is where you live. Like if you're in Geyserville and it's super hot in the summer and it's not really the best place for coffee berry, they're going to want irrigation and they're not going to be wanting to be pruned hard. But at the coast or in Sebastopol or more in a West County, they seem to be tolerating like hard cutting. Jennifer, is that your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. It's so hard, to talk about specifics. I mean, 35 microclimates in Sonoma County. Like I'm in Sebastopol, so I know Sebastopol area plants really well. And you really have to live with these plants and care for them over, time to see what they like best.
And like Jennifer was talking about, like the important thing is like to look on calscape.org and really understand your plant community in your area. Because like Mimi may be able to use coffee berry in the shade up where she is in Geyserville or Cloverdale. And like there's different areas. Like you just really need to understand your plants and really, and that Calscape tool is pretty amazing to tell you what works best in your area and what plant communities you can use. And also with climate change, I feel like it's hotter here in Sebastopol. It's hotter heading north. And so we might need to start adapting our plant materials and our irrigation. If we want a floriferous garden, we might need to decide that we're going to add some more water. I'm paying for water in Sebastopol now, and I'm shocked at how much I have to pay. And so now I'm like, okay, what do I want? What are the plants that I'm willing to spend this money on just to keep them going? And what areas do I want to let brown out in the summer?
It's all a balancing act. Okay, so moving away from natives, next question is around European ivy, which is growing along one side of this attendee's house on a sloped creek bank. It's green all year round. Is it flammable? A lot or a little? We keep it 5 feet or so from the house and deck. So maybe I'll start in on this one, you guys.
You
go. So that's fantastic to hear you're keeping it 5 feet from the house and deck so that you're creating your 0 to 5 around your structure and your attached decks. Flammability, it's probably unirrigated, I would imagine. I don't know if it's in shade, if it's in full sun, don't know what kind of aspect it has. You definitely want to, it can get large woody buildup. You could get a lot of debris that could fall in there and get held in there, especially if there's trees around that sloped creek bank. So you definitely want to keep on top of maintaining it in your 5 to 30 foot zone. It's kind of hard to gauge, if it's a lot flammable or a little flammable. It's low to the ground. You definitely want to make sure it's not going to transmit the fire up into the crown of trees. So make sure it's not climbing up any trees, or that just carries the flame from the ground plane right up into the canopy of the trees. And certainly maintain your vigilance, keeping it away from the house. Anything you'd add, April or Jen? Okay.
No, it's a great answer, Mimi, especially, yeah, the ladder fuel thing. And the only other thing if I missed it, but I don't think we said tonight, like all plants burn, all plants can burn. So even the best, succulenty thing can burn. So just exactly, it's about maintenance and vigilance.
Well said.
And I live in a very urban environment, and we don't talk about that enough, I think, in these workshops. But I'm looking out, I'm sitting out on my porch, and my neighbor, between the two of us, there's a wood fence with ivy growing on it, and I am consistently cutting it back. There's
Yeah.
rodents in there. It's very woody, but I can't talk them into replacing it. So sometimes we have to work, like I can't work with my neighbor on that, but like, so I'm cutting it back on my side. But when you live in an urban environment, you're really, it's really hard to watch that situation and just try to keep it. Like I try to cut all the leaves off, keep the woody part, and then water it some. But ivy can be a ground cover, but it can also be a wall. So
Yeah.
it's challenging.
And for me, it's Vinca.
Vinca is another one.
So we've got some really great creativity going on in the audience. There's a couple questions around, can broken tiles be used in this mixed application? I'm assuming we're talking about in the 0 to 5 foot zone. Or is there something about the composition of regular old-fashioned bathroom tile? And then I don't know if it's the same attendee was asking again, are crushed, broken, old household bathroom tiles okay in the 0 to 5?
That's fun.
Yeah, I think that's a great creative solution, reusing a material. Yeah, I'm not aware of any.
Compacted base rock, and then you can do whatever you want on top of that. It's a really inexpensive way to do the base rock, and then you could use all kinds of interesting things in that space.
And then a question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Oh, I was just gonna say, send us pictures if you do it. We'd
Yes,
love to have that.
we love any pictures that anybody wants to share. A question about, should compost be used in vegetable gardens? Absolutely. That's one of the classic applications for annual plant materials that require a lot of nutrition in a short season.
Apply compost heavy and often in your vegetable garden.
There you go. But Barbara is saying her viticulture professor thinks it's a waste to put compost on too early in the rainy season, as he put it. If you do that, your compost will be in Jenner when you really need it in the soil for spring growth. So, Jen, any suggestions around compost timing application?
Yeah, I love that. I've never heard that. I'm gonna steal that one. Yeah, you want to do it when the rains are coming. Right before the rains are coming, so it will infiltrate right where it is, but be mindful of, if you have runoff situations, but also when you're out there using your hose, you're acting like the rain. So keep the nutrients where they're needed. Smaller applications many times would be better than like a big application if you're worried about runoff.
And then we've got a couple different questions around ground covers or native turf grasses. Jen, I know you talked about the native turf grass. Barbara's asking for the best native turf grass for an irrigated area in the 0 to 5 foot space. And Anne is asking for ground cover recommendations in zone 0, clay soil, full sun, any recommendations? Something like woolly thyme, which she uses between concrete cracks. Any comments or feedback for folks on those questions?
Yeah, I love the irrigated bent grass. And April, you've been working with some different grasses, creating some meadows, and you might have more insight on that.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of thyme or woolly thyme needs a lot of irrigation. So anything in between pavers, it's tricky. I can't say that I've found the plant to do that. That's native or non-native. We are having some tricky, like I've recommended these native bent grass and turf products for the 0 to 5, but over the years, I've had more and more problems with them, needing a lot of water and a lot of care and a lot of maintenance. We've been leaning on using plugs or not using the bent grass. The turf products get thatchy, and they do need a lot of water to be in the 0 to 5. So we can't just and like 5 years ago, I was like, just use these bent grasses or these turfs in the 0 to 5, but you really I think it needs more maintenance, and it gets thatchy, so I can't 100% recommend it anymore. So some so back to 0 to 5, best practices being no plant material, succulents in pots. There's just not the super solution. Even turf, like non-native turf, there's fine fescue that is a lower water use turf, but there's a lot of problems in that space. So I can't recommend anything in the 0 to 5 zone that isn't non-plant material right now.
Oh, you're muted.
Apologies, sorry, I'm muted because I was coughing. There are, if you're looking for plant recommendations, there's so many amazing resources. The Master Gardener of Sonoma County program website that Jen shared earlier has extensive plant recommendation sections. California Native Plant Society that Jen shared, and CalScape, amazing plant recommendations. It's kind of hard to make specific plant recommendations in a workshop like this, because we don't know your exact conditions and application, and so there's lots of resources though available to you, and anybody's always welcome to send an email to the Master Gardener program, and I can throw our email address in the chat, and we can do research and answer your question for you as well. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes left. We had a question about killing invasive trumpet vine that was cut down and is now popping up all over the yard. Also might be a good one to send to our Master Gardener information desk.
Yeah,
Invasive
I bet you
plants
guys
are,
have more information about that.
yeah, invasive plants are always a real struggle.
And vines tend to be invasive, so you have to be really it's very tricky with vines. Like we were talking about ivy, or many of the vines can be invasive.
And then someone's asking, how should we fill in gaps between decking boards, stairs, etc.? Screen, mesh, the whole thing.
I've been recommending, I don't know exactly what they mean, but like under decks, I'm sitting on my deck right here in Defensible, but using base rock or really cleaning up under your decks is super important. And it can be, just using like cleaning out under your decks and using drain rock all under, if you have to have a wood deck or anything like that, like that's a way to be more fire wise.
Sorry, I was trying to type in the chat. And then other than aesthetic concerns, is there any other reason not to use landscape fabric under river rock?
Yes, other than aesthetic, if the landscape fabric is plastic based, plastic photo degrades, so it degrades in sun and it just gets into smaller and smaller pieces. That is super hard to clean up, and then it's getting into waterways or sitting in our soil, and it's not the healthiest choice. So be mindful of that.
And if any of you have like bought a house or come into a house, like you end up with the landscape fabric from the past. So I always am so frustrated, like digging up, like even here I have turf, like somebody put in turf and the plastic under the grid of the turf is still there. And so I'm pulling up green plastic all the time. So just thinking about the future people that might be in your landscape, like Jen said.
That's so true. And then we've got somebody who raised a hand. I can go ahead. We have just a minute left, but Mark, if you have a quick question, I've allowed you to talk. Mark, if you had a question you wanted to pose to the group, do you want to unmute? If you're still there, Mark. Sorry if we took a while to get to you. All right, we may have. Oh, no, we may have lost it.
Oh.
Well, I think that's it. We're right on time at 7 o'clock. Thank you, Jen. Great job in the presentation. Thank you to our translators for their able assistance with the Spanish translation. Appreciate you all spending some of your time with us to learn about this important topic, and look forward to getting an email with the recording and all the links for more information for your reference.
Great.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, everybody.
And Rachel behind the scenes. Amazing. work. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Great night, everybody.
Night.